Bolivanaka, everyone. For the Pacific, the last 6 years has come with successes, but we've also been faced with challenges. Of note would have been the endorsement of the Framework for Resilient Development in the Pacific, which is basically the integrated strategy that the Pacific has that basically brings together some of the commitments under the Paris Agreement, as well as with the Sendai Framework of Action. The work around the Framework for Resilient Development is actually quite key for us, because it doesn't just provide us with some guidance, but what it also does is actually it brings together a composite of partners who actually work in this space along with the countries that we're working in. The work is actually coordinated through a 15-member task force that includes representatives from across civil society, countries, plus the development partners in the private sector that we work with. And this is quite key as well, because the very partners that we're actually engaging with in the region are the same partners who support and work with countries through the response, the recovery, as well as the long-term development priorities that countries have. So what are some of the changes that we've had? One of the things that we've seen is the involvement of central agencies getting involved during the response and really starting to set the scene towards the recovery effort. Really that initial planning towards where do we go to for the recovery work. However, that said, what we do realize is that, as with the Caribbean, the governance and the institutional arrangements around recovery are not always well defined, nor are they well understood. Which is sort of a strange place to be, given that you have this really robust, coordinated humanitarian response, and then when you're starting to look into recovery, and with a pathway towards development, you suddenly find that we're again being quite focused in terms of the sector that we're working in. I'm also missing that opportunity to collaborate with the other partners and with the sectors that make up government, as well as the partners that actually could provide support if needed for recovery. Post-disaster needs assessments have been one way or one avenue in which we've been able to bring sectors together in the Pacific, and not just identifying the recovery needs, but also in helping the sectors actually come together to evaluate what are those contributions to the disaster effects that we're actually calculating. And what we're finding is that if Build Back Better is not about investing in resilience, then what is it? And I think that's probably the change that we don't always see as we transition from response to recovery, and ensuring that recovery is actually embedded within the development priorities of countries. And I recall a conversation very early on. When I say early on, I mean about 10 years ago, following an assessment, and it was about improving access to wash services following a flood event. And the conversation was around whether or not it belonged in a recovery framework, or whether it was something as a development priority. And I think herein lies the problem, because if we're not addressing development priorities in our recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction effort, then we're really setting ourselves up to repeat the same experiences that we're actually going through when we're in response phase, and potentially also an exacerbated impact or effect. Now, in addition to the institutional arrangements or the governance arrangements for countries, there is also a need for that to be supported also by the requisite capability needs for people working in this space. So, aside from the engineering or policy expertise that tends to be provided to work through governments, there's also a need for us to work with our counterparts. And some of this may fall outside of the recovery phase itself, But we do need to provide that opportunity for countries to be able to grow that expertise. And this might be something, as mundane as having project management capability. One of the realities of COVID for the region has been that countries have also had to look inwards, to look at their capabilities in-house or in the countries, to see how, one, they can actually coordinate their own response, but also in looking at what can we do now for recovery. And Vanuatu in 2020, when Tropical Cyclone Harold went over the northern part of the group, looked and mobilized to try and see, one, who was going to actually anchor the recovery work, and where could they actually source support from partners externally. And this was really done really by a UNDP who provided that support, that TA. However, all the groundwork was actually done by the sectors, coordinated by the Office of the Prime Minister. And this really re-emphasizes for us the need for capacity development to be able to, one, assess the disaster effects, but also to help with the design and the implementation of the recovery program itself. And one of the challenges that we often have when coming up with recovery packages is, how do we actually ensure that the recovery itself is going to be risk informed? And one of the concerns that's often raised is the cost of actually being risk smart. And I think that there's some learnings and some lessons that we can share from across from similar small island developing states and from other regions. But at least for the recovery program, some of the lessons that we've learned is, one, is that there's definitely a need for us to be able to upskill and engage our local expertise, strengthen and develop some of the capabilities around project management. And governance arrangements for recovery also needs to be understood by the partners, the sectors, the agencies who actually work together to support the recovery effort. And Christelle, that's it from me.